The orange survey stakes appeared on a Tuesday. 3 of them, driven into the gravel shoulder of the county road that borders my eastern fence line, each one flagged with a strip of plastic that snapped in the October wind like a small bright tongue. I noticed them on my way back from checking the diesel tank at the road gate. I pulled one out of the ground. The metal shaft was stamped with a code I didn't recognize and a date from 10 days earlier. Someone had been measuring my property while I was standing on it. And I never saw them do it. My name is OUTBREAK. I own 411 acres of mixed hardwood and cleared pasture in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, bordered on 3 sides by national forest and on the 4th by a state route that hasn't been repaved since I was in high school. I am not a survivalist. I am not a militia member. I have never subscribed to a single newsletter about the end of the world. What I am is a man who inherited land from a father who inherited it from his father, and who spent the 11 months since the Chattanooga outbreak turning that land into something that could keep people alive when everything south of Crossville started dying. I didn't build the compound because I was afraid. I built it because I could see what was coming. And I had the acreage, the equipment, and the stubbornness to do something about it. The first fence went up in January, 8-foot game wire with a lean-out at the top, running 1,700 feet along the road frontage. By March, I'd enclosed the inner 30 acres around the house, the barn, the equipment shed, and the old tobacco drying house my grandfather built in 1961. By May, I had a functional well with a hand pump backup, a diesel generator with 400 gallons in reserve, a root cellar packed with canned goods, and a chicken run producing more eggs than I could eat. By July, I had neighbors. That's the part nobody outside this county understands. I didn't recruit anyone, I didn't advertise, I didn't post anything online or nail flyers to telephone poles. What happened was simpler and older than any of that. Donnie and Pam Suttles lost their house in Pikeville when the infection crossed the Sequatchie Valley and the National Guard pulled back to the interstate. They showed up at my gate with a truck full of clothes and a 12-year-old boy named Marcus, who hadn't spoken in 6 days. I let them in because Donnie's father and mine had swapped hay equipment for 30 years. 2 days later, Donnie's cousin Rita arrived with her husband Gene and their infant daughter. Then the Worley family from Fall Creek. Then an elderly couple named Harmon, whose names I never learned to spell correctly, and whose house had burned when the infected pushed through Spencer. By the time the first frost hit, I had 41 people living on my property, not in my house, in a distributed arrangement that made sense to anyone who'd ever worked a farm. The Suttles took the tobacco house. The Worleys converted the hay barn. Gene and Rita set up in the equipment shed after we insulated it with hay bales and plastic sheeting. The Harmons stayed in a camper I'd pulled out of a ditch on Route 30. Others brought tents that we gradually replaced with framed structures using lumber milled from deadfall on the North Ridge. Every person who arrived brought something: tools, medical supplies, seed stock, trade skills, labor. Nobody was dead weight because nobody was allowed to be. Not by my decree, by the arithmetic of the situation. The infected reached our perimeter once in August and twice in September. The first time, a group of 7 came up the logging road on the north boundary. We heard them before we saw them. Donnie and I dropped 3 from the tree line at 60 yards. The others turned east into the forest and didn't come back. The second and third times were smaller, singles and pairs, disoriented, moving along the creek bed. We handled it. The fence held. The watch rotation worked. The system I'd built functioned exactly as I'd designed it to function, which is the precise thing that brought the government to my gate. The woman's name was Lieutenant Colonel Dana Presswood. She arrived on the 14th of October in an unmarked tan SUV with federal plates, accompanied by a sergeant I was never introduced to and a civilian in a blue windbreaker who carried a clipboard and never made eye contact with anyone. They didn't come through the main gate. They parked at the road shoulder near where the survey stakes had been and waited until Donnie radioed me from the East Watch Post. I walked down to meet them with my rifle slung across my back, which I later learned was noted in her report as a display of armed posture during initial contact. Presswood stepped out first. She was tall, composed, military short hair going silver at the temples. She didn't smile. She didn't extend her hand. She said my name like she was reading it from a file, which she was. Mr. Brack, I'm with the Joint Civilian Infrastructure Task Force out of Fort Campbell. We've been conducting aerial assessments of organized settlements in the southeastern corridor. Your property was flagged in August. I asked what it was flagged for. Structural density, thermal signature, agricultural activity inconsistent with a single household operation. I told her it was consistent with 41 people trying not to die. She nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. The civilian in the windbreaker wrote something on his clipboard. Presswood asked if she could see the interior of the settlement. I told her she could see it from where she was standing, which was true. The main compound was visible from the road. I had nothing to hide. That was the first of several things I believed that turned out to be wrong. Over the next 90 minutes, Presswood walked the perimeter road with me. She asked about water supply, sanitation, food production, medical capability, and defensive posture in that order. I answered every question honestly. She noted the fence construction, the watch rotation schedule posted inside the gatehouse, the firearms inventory board Donnie had built and mounted in the barn. She counted structures. She asked about governance. I told her there wasn't any governance. People did what needed doing, and I coordinated because it was my land and I knew its contours. She asked how disputes were resolved. I said we hadn't had any that couldn't be settled by two adults talking on a porch. She wrote something down. I didn't like the way she wrote it. There's a particular way a person holds a pen when they're not recording what you said but translating it into a category you wouldn't recognize. Before she left, she handed me a single-page document on Department of Homeland Security letterhead. It was titled Provisional Settlement Classification Notice. My property had been designated a Category 3 unincorporated civilian installation. The document listed obligations including census reporting, resource inventory disclosure, and compliance with regional coordination directives to be issued by the task force. At the bottom, in a paragraph I almost missed, it stated that Category 3 installations operating without federal liaison integration would be subject to reclassification review, which could include restricted movement corridors, supply interdiction, or compulsory population transfer. I read it twice. Then I looked at Presswood and asked her, in plain language, what happened if I threw this paper in my burn barrel and told her not to come back? She didn't hesitate. Then your settlement gets reclassified as Category 5, which is an uncooperative armed enclave. And the next people who come won't be from my office. She got back in the SUV. The sergeant drove. The civilian hadn't looked up from his clipboard the entire visit. I stood at the road with that paper in my hand for 10 minutes after they left. The wind picked up. I could hear Marcus Suttles laughing somewhere behind the tree line, the first sound that boy had made in weeks that wasn't crying. And it was happening inside a fence I'd built on land my family had held for 112 years. Land that someone in a windbreaker had just counted and coded and claimed to have authority over because I'd made it work. I called a meeting that night in the barn. Everyone who could walk attended. I read Presswood's document aloud by lantern light, stopping after each paragraph to let people absorb it. Donnie leaned against the tractor bay door with his arms crossed, his jaw working like he was chewing something that wouldn't break down. Pam sat on a hay bale with Marcus pressed against her side, her hand resting on the back of his neck. Gene stood near the rear with his infant daughter asleep against his chest, his free hand gripping the stall railing. The Worley family occupied the bench I'd built from oak planks in the spring. Old man Harmon sat in a folding chair his wife had carried from their camper, his face unreadable. When I finished reading, the barn was quiet. Then Donnie said what I'd been thinking since the SUV pulled away. "They're not asking permission, Earl. They're telling you the permission's already been given. To themselves. By themselves." He was right. The document's language was structured so that compliance appeared voluntary, while refusal triggered an automatic escalation. It was a mechanism I recognized from property tax disputes and eminent domain proceedings, the machinery of institutional patience. They weren't threatening me. They were informing me that my cooperation had already been scheduled, and my only choice was the timeline. Rita spoke next. She asked a question that reframed everything. "What are they actually offering?" I looked at the paper again. Nothing. No medical support. No supply delivery. No defensive assistance. No integration into a protected corridor. The document listed 17 obligations and 0 provisions. It was a claims form disguised as a partnership. Carl Worley, who had been a county planning commissioner before Pikeville fell, raised his hand like we were in a board meeting. Old habits. He said the classification language matched FEMA continuity of government frameworks he'd reviewed in his former role. He said Category 3 was a holding designation. It meant that they'd identified us as organized enough to be useful, but hadn't decided yet whether to absorb us or dismantle us. Category 5, the designation Presswood had threatened, was the language they used for groups they intended to neutralize. "Neutralize how?" Pam asked. Carl shrugged. "Depends on what they've got. Could be economic. Cut off your fuel supply, your medical access, your ability to trade with anyone in the corridor. Could be physical. Blockade the road, restrict movement, eventually come in with enough personnel to relocate everyone to a federal site. Could be violent," Donnie said. Carl nodded slowly. Could be violent. The barn went quiet again. I watched people's faces. Some of them were scared. Some were angry. A few looked resigned in a way I'd seen before. The expression of people who had already been displaced once and recognized the machinery warming up to do it again. Old man Harmon's wife reached over and took his hand without looking at him. I told them what I thought. I said this land had been in my family for 4 generations, and that I had spent every resource and every hour of labor I had making it into something that kept us alive. I said no one in a tan SUV was going to reclassify my home as a threat because I'd done their job better than they had. And I said that if they wanted to come back, they would find the gate locked and the fence intact and 41 people who had decided that surviving on their own terms was not a crime. The barn erupted, not in argument, in something more complicated. Relief mixed with dread. Agreement spiked with the knowledge that agreement was the first step on a road none of us could see the end of. Donnie clapped once, loud. Gene shifted his daughter to his other arm and nodded. Rita stared at the floor. Carl Worley folded his hands in his lap and said nothing else. Marcus Suttles, 12 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered something. Pam leaned down, listened, then looked at me across the lantern light. He wants to know if they'll take the chickens. I promised him they wouldn't. It was the second thing I was wrong about. The first consequence arrived 4 days later. And it wasn't a convoy or a blockade. It was the absence of a truck. Every 2 weeks since August, a regional fuel distributor operating under federal license had been running diesel along Route 30. I'd arranged a standing purchase through a broker in Dunlap. Cash transaction, 200 gallons per delivery. The truck didn't come. I drove to Dunlap myself. The broker, a man named Teague, who'd sold fuel to my father for 15 years, met me in his office with the door closed. He said the distribution license now required destination verification for all deliveries exceeding 50 gallons. My property address had been flagged in the verification system. He couldn't fill the order. He showed me the screen. Where my address should have appeared, there was a yellow banner that read, "Delivery restricted. Contact Regional Coordination Authority." Teague looked at me the way people look at someone who's just been diagnosed. Sympathetic, but already calculating distance. "Earl, whatever you did, undo it." I hadn't done anything. That was the machinery. You don't have to do anything for the machinery to work. You just have to be classified. The classification itself generates the restriction, and the restriction generates the pressure, and the pressure is designed to produce one outcome: compliance. It's not punishment, it's physics. I drove back with an empty truck bed and a fuel gauge showing a quarter tank. When I told Donnie, he pulled out a pencil and started calculating. At current consumption rates, we had 19 days of generator fuel. After that, no power for the well pump, the refrigeration unit, the perimeter lights, or the radio. "They didn't send soldiers," Donnie said. "They sent a spreadsheet." Over the next week, 2 more supply lines closed. The veterinary supply house in Crossville that had been selling us antibiotics at markup stopped answering calls. A woman at the Sequatchie Valley Agricultural Co-op, told Gene when he drove up to buy fence wire that she'd been instructed not to process orders from addresses under coordination review. She apologized. She looked terrified. Not of us, of whatever had generated the instruction. I want to be precise about what was happening. The federal government, or what remained of it operating through Fort Campbell's regional authority, had not attacked us, had not threatened us with weapons, had not issued a warrant or an arrest order or a demand. They had simply made us expensive to interact with. Every entity that touched our supply chain was now required to verify our status before completing a transaction. And our status was a color that meant delay, which in practice meant denial. We were being made into a gap in the economy, a place where goods didn't flow, and in a survival landscape where goods are oxygen. The effect was suffocation by paperwork. I gathered the compound and explained the fuel situation. I showed them the numbers. 19 days was now 14. The room smelled like hay and kerosene and the particular sweat of people absorbing bad news. I proposed 3 immediate measures. First, we'd shift the well to hand pump operation permanently and decommission the electric pump. Second, we'd reduce generator use to 4 hours per day, allocated to refrigeration and the radio. Third, we'd begin identifying alternative fuel sources, including siphoning from abandoned vehicles along the highway corridor between here and Spencer. Carl Worley raised his hand again. This time, he didn't wait to be called on. "Earl, have you considered that this is exactly what they want? They restrict your supplies, you start scavenging, and scavenging outside your perimeter gives them the behavioral evidence to reclassify you as hostile." The barn went silent. Carl's logic was flawless. Every move we made to compensate for the restriction became justification for further restriction. The compound was being converted into a trap made of our own responses. That night, Donnie and I sat on the porch and didn't talk for a long time. The generator was off. The perimeter lights were dark. The stars over Bledsoe County were brutal in their clarity, the way they always are when every human light within 30 miles has been extinguished. Finally, Donnie said, "They're not trying to kill us, Earl. They're trying to make it so expensive to be us that we volunteer to be them." I need to describe what the compound actually was, because the document Presswood filed described something I didn't recognize. I obtained a copy later, through means I'll explain. In her assessment, my property was characterized as a fortified paramilitary enclave with armed perimeter security, centralized command authority, unregistered population, and resource hoarding capacity exceeding reasonable civilian need. There was a phrase I remember exactly. Settlement exhibits hallmarks of emergent warlordism consistent with Category 3 to 5 transition indicators. Warlordism. I have a degree in agricultural science from UT Martin. I have owned a John Deere dealership service contract for 11 years. I once spent 4 months trying to breed a cold, hardy fig tree. The most authoritarian thing I have ever done is tell Donnie Suttles he couldn't park his truck on the septic field. What the compound actually was, a farm with a fence around it. The watch rotation existed because the infected came at night and someone had to see them. The firearms were hunting rifles, shotguns, and 3 handguns, all legally purchased, all stored in a locked cabinet in the barn, with a checkout sheet because Donnie was a meticulous man who'd been a rural carrier for the Postal Service and couldn't stop organizing things into routes and inventories. The structures were converted agricultural buildings insulated with available materials. The food supply was a combination of stored goods and active production. Chickens, a kitchen garden, a small greenhouse built from salvaged storm windows. We had no military equipment, no communications beyond a single CB radio and a weather band receiver. No chain of command. But I understand why it looked the way it looked from the air. Thermal imaging at altitude reads a heated barn full of people the same way it reads a barracks. A fence with watchposts looks like a perimeter defense installation when you're looking for perimeter defense installations. Armed individuals moving in patterns that correspond to shift changes look like a military rotation. The assessment was technically accurate in the way a photograph of a dog can technically be described as a quadrupedal predator with exposed dentition. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't true. The distinction mattered because the classification drove everything that followed. Once my property existed in the federal system as a potential threat, every interaction with it was filtered through threat protocols. The fuel restriction wasn't punitive. It was precautionary. Presswood wasn't lying when she said the next visit would be different. She was describing a bureaucratic inevitability. My file would move from her desk to someone else's desk. And the someone else would not be an infrastructure assessor. They would be a tactical operations planner whose job was to resolve Category 3 installations before they became Category 5 problems. I know this because Carl Worley told me, and Carl's knowledge of government classification systems proved to be the single most important resource in the compound, more valuable than the diesel, the antibiotics, or the ammunition. Carl had served on a county emergency planning committee that interfaced with FEMA Region 4. He understood the taxonomy. He knew that classifications were not descriptions, but predictions. The government wasn't documenting what we were. It was documenting what it believed we would become. And once the prediction existed in a file, the file generated the conditions that made the prediction accurate. Carl proposed something I initially rejected. He said I should invite Presswood back, not to comply, not to surrender, to present a counter-document, a formal census, a resource inventory, a governance charter, all voluntarily disclosed, structured to match the federal framework's own language. not to satisfy the classification, but to replace it, to insert data into the system that contradicted the prediction before the prediction became operational. "You're telling me to write them a report card on myself," I said. "I'm telling you to write the report card before they grade you," Carl said. "Because right now, they're grading a photograph taken from 11,000 feet. And the grade is F." I told Carl I'd think about it. What I actually did was walk the fence line alone until midnight, touching each post I'd set with my own hands, counting them the way you count the vertebrae of something you built and loved, and suddenly realize other people have plans for. The infected complicated everything, as they always do. On the night of October 21st, 9 days after Presswood's visit, a group came through the north boundary that was unlike anything we'd encountered. Not 7 like August, not singles and pairs like September. 40 or more moving south through the national forest in a loose column that suggested they'd been channeled by terrain rather than directed by intent. Our North Watch, manned that night by Gene and a quiet man named Dale Colvin, who'd arrived in September with a broken collarbone and a functioning chainsaw, lit the first flare at 2 in the morning. I reached the north fence in 4 minutes. The sound was already wrong. Not the disorganized stumbling we'd learned to expect, but a sustained pressure against the wire. Dozens of bodies leaning into the same section simultaneously. The fence was designed for deer and single-figure encounters. It was not designed for mass. The posts nearest the logging road were bowing inward, the wire singing a high metallic note I'd never heard before. Donnie arrived with 3 others. We put lights on them. The infected filled the tree line in a crescent that wrapped from the logging road to the creek bed, more than I could count in the dark. Their faces were white and gray in the flare light, mouths open, hands gripping the wire without reaction to the barbs cutting their palms. They didn't climb. They pushed. The fence was a problem they were solving with arithmetic. We fired from the tree line on our side, working methodically from the flanks inward. Gene proved to be an excellent shot under pressure, something I hadn't known about him. Dale, one-armed, worked the flare gun. It took 40 minutes to reduce the pressure enough for the fence to straighten. We lost a 16-foot section near the logging road where 3 posts snapped at ground level. By dawn, we had a gap in the perimeter and 31 bodies on the other side of the wire. I organized a repair crew and had the gap fenced with salvaged cattle panels and T-posts by noon. But the breach had been visible, not to us, to whatever surveillance apparatus the task force had trained on my property from altitude or from the ridge line east of the road. Because at 4 that afternoon, a drone passed over the compound at an altitude low enough to hear. Not a military drone, a consumer-grade quadcopter, the kind you can buy at a sporting goods store. It made 2 slow circuits of the north boundary where the damaged fence was visible, then flew east and disappeared over the tree line. Donnie watched it go. "That's not Presswood's," he said. "That's someone checking whether the fence is still up." He was right in a way neither of us fully understood yet. The drone wasn't federal. It belonged to a group we hadn't encountered, operating from a position on the eastern ridge I hadn't known was occupied. But its presence meant something specific to the task force's assessment framework. It meant other organized groups were surveilling my compound. Which meant my compound was a strategic feature in a landscape that contained competing interests. Which elevated the classification risk from administrative inconvenience to active operational concern. I didn't know any of this yet. What I knew was that 41 people had just survived a mass incursion with hunting rifles and a fence I'd built for deer, that my fuel supply was dropping towards single digits, and that somewhere in a federal database, my farm was being described in language that made it sound like the threat instead of the thing the threat had just tried to eat. That night, I found Marcus Suttles sitting outside the tobacco house, cross-legged in the dirt, staring at the dark tree line where the infected had come through. He wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He was counting something on his fingers, mouthing numbers. I asked him what he was doing. "Counting the seconds between the sounds," he said. "They're different now." I didn't ask what he meant. I sat down beside him and listened to the forest, and he was right. Something in the rhythm of the night had changed. The woods were not quiet. They were waiting. Presswood returned on October 26th, but she didn't come alone. The SUV was the same, the sergeant was the same, but the civilian in the windbreaker had been replaced by 2 men in tactical vests with sidearms visible, and a woman carrying a portable radio unit whose antenna extended above the vehicle's roofline. They parked in the same spot. The survey stakes had reappeared. I hadn't pulled them this time. I met them at the gate with Carl Worley beside me. Donnie was positioned at the east watchpost with a clear line of sight. I'd told him to be visible but not threatening, which is a distinction that means everything to me, and nothing to an assessment team trained to read bodies as posture codes. Presswood's tone had changed. Not hostile, clinical. She addressed me as Mr. Brack the same way, but the cadence was different. She was performing a protocol now, not conducting a conversation. She informed me that aerial surveillance had documented a significant armed engagement on my property on October 21st, that the perimeter breach and subsequent repair indicated both the scale of external threat and the compound's militarized response capability, and that these factors had triggered an expedited reclassification review. "You're being upgraded to Category 4, she said. "This is not a punitive designation. It reflects the assessed threat environment around your installation and the observed defensive capacity within it." I asked what Category 4 meant in practical terms. The woman with the radio answered. She introduced herself as Regional Coordinator Allison Vance from Fort Campbell's Civilian Settlement Division. She had a binder. She opened it to a tabbed page. Category 4 required mandatory population registry, biometric enrollment of all residents, weekly resource audits conducted by task force personnel, integration of a federal liaison officer who would reside on site, and subordination of defensive operations to Regional Coordination Authority. I let her finish. Then I told her that none of those things were going to happen. Carl put his hand on my arm, not to restrain me, to buy time. He asked Vance a specific question. "What is the assessed viability rating of the federal secure zone at Fort Campbell as of this week?" Vance's expression flickered, just for a moment. The kind of micro-expression that tells you the question landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. She said Fort Campbell's operational status was classified. Carl nodded. "The reason I ask is that your own distribution network is failing. The fuel restriction you placed on Mr. Brack's property is part of a regional rationing protocol that indicates your supply lines are compromised. You're not restricting us because we're a threat. You're restricting us because you don't have enough to share, and you need to control who gets what's left." Presswood looked at Carl for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Brack, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a serious person. The Regional Coordination Authority is operating at 62% capacity. The installations we're managing are consuming more than we're receiving. Your settlement is self-sustaining in ways that most of the federal sites are not. That makes you strategically significant. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I understood. She was telling me they needed what I had. The classification, the restrictions, the bureaucratic pressure were the grammar of acquisition. Not because they were evil, because they were an institution running out of resources, and institutions running out of resources don't ask. They classify, they restrict, they reclassify, and then they integrate. It's not malice. It's metabolism. I told Presswood I needed 48 hours to consult with my people. She agreed. Vance closed her binder. The men in tactical vests hadn't moved or spoken. As they were leaving, Presswood stopped and turned back. She said something I carry with me, even now. Mr. Brack, I've assessed 31 settlements in this region. 23 of them are failing. Yours is the only one I've visited twice. That should tell you something about your position that my paperwork cannot. The SUV pulled away. Carl and I stood at the gate in the October wind. The survey stakes cast thin shadows into the afternoon light. She just told you they're losing, Carl said. She told me they're shopping, I said. I called the second barn meeting for that evening. This time I brought Carl's counterproposal, which he and I had drafted in the 3 hours between Presswood's departure and sundown. But before I could present it, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Rita stood up first. She didn't wait for me to speak. She was holding her daughter against her shoulder, and her voice was the kind of calm that comes from having already decided something. Earl, Jean and I have been talking. We want to hear what the government is actually offering before we decide to refuse it. The barn went still. Not because the statement was radical, because it was the first time anyone had spoken in opposition to my position inside these walls. I'd told Presswood no. I'd assumed that no was collective. I'd assumed wrong. Rita continued. She said she'd been counting days. 14 days of generator fuel left. Antibiotics gone in 3 weeks. The fence breach on the north side had proven the perimeter was inadequate for a sustained threat. The compound was functional but declining. She said she loved what I'd built. She said she was grateful. And then she said a sentence that opened a crack in the floor of everything. But grateful doesn't mean I have to die here because you can't share a fence. Jean stood beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence beside his wife, holding their daughter, was a statement of alignment that required no words. I looked around the barn. The Worleys were watching me. Dale Colvin was studying his boots. The Harmons held hands the way they always held hands, a single unit processing the world and through a shared grip. Pam Suttles had her arm around Marcus. Donnie was at the door, arms crossed, looking at the floor. I want to be honest about what I felt. Not anger, something worse. Betrayal, but the kind where you know the other person isn't wrong. Rita had done the same arithmetic I'd been doing and reached a different answer. My answer was, we hold the line and find alternatives. Her answer was, the line is moving and holding it costs more than crossing it. She wasn't disloyal, she was rational. And rationality, when it contradicts the thing you built with your hands, feels exactly like a knife. Carl stepped in. He presented the counterproposal. Not compliance, not refusal. A structured bilateral agreement in which the compound would voluntarily provide census data, resource transparency, and agricultural output sharing in exchange for guaranteed supply access, medical support, and explicit written acknowledgement of the settlement's autonomous governance. He'd formatted it on paper torn from a ledger book, in language that mirrored the federal document's own structure. It was brilliant. It was the kind of thing only a man who'd spent 20 years in county government could produce, under lantern light, with a pencil. The barn debated for 2 hours. I mostly listened. What emerged was not consensus, but a spectrum. Donnie and 4 others wanted to refuse all contact. Rita, Jean, and 6 others wanted to engage on the best available terms. The remaining 28 occupied positions between these poles, shifting as arguments landed. Carl's proposal became the center of gravity by default. not because everyone loved it, but because it was the only option that didn't require anyone to lose everything. I agreed to present it to Presswood, not because I believed it would work, because the alternative was watching my compound fracture along the line Rita had just drawn. And a fractured compound is not a compound at all. It's two groups occupying the same fence with different intentions, which is worse than no fence whatsoever. That night, after everyone had gone to their structures, Donnie found me at the tool bench in the barn. He was carrying a thermos of coffee and the expression of a man about to say something he'd rather swallow. "Earl, she's right. Rita, she's right, and you know it." "I know it." "So why does it feel like losing?" "Because it is losing. It's just losing slow instead of losing fast." He poured 2 cups. We drank in silence. Somewhere outside, the chickens shifted on their roost, making small sounds of adjustment in the dark. I delivered Carl's proposal to Presswood at a meeting point she designated, a gas station 2 miles south on Route 30 that had been converted into a task force checkpoint. She read it standing up, holding the pages at arm's length the way someone reads a letter they didn't expect to receive in a language they didn't expect to be addressed in. Vance stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. "You wrote a treaty," Presswood said. "Carl Worley wrote a bilateral agreement." "Who's Carl Worley?" "Former county planning commissioner. He understands your framework." Presswood folded the papers and put them in her jacket. She said she'd need to send it up the chain, which meant Fort Campbell, which meant delay, which meant the fuel clock kept running. I asked, as a measure of good faith, whether the fuel restriction could be lifted during the review period. She said she'd see what she could do. 2 days later, Teague called on the CB to say his delivery system had been unblocked. 100 gallons arrived that Thursday. Not 200, 100. Enough to breathe, not enough to relax. The dosage of a negotiation, not a gift. Meanwhile, the Eastern Ridge problem was growing. Dale Colvin, whose broken collarbone had healed into a functional if crooked shoulder, had been running reconnaissance along the tree line since the drone sighting. On the 29th, he came back with information that reorganized everything. There was a group on the ridge, not infected, living people. Approximately 20, occupying a series of hunting cabins along a fire road that connected to the state highway 6 miles north. They had vehicles, they had weapons, and they had been watching my compound since at least mid-September, which meant they'd watched us fight the infected, watched us repair the fence, watched Presswood come and go, and chosen to remain invisible through all of it. Dale had made contact, not deliberately. He'd been spotted on the ridge and approached by 2 men carrying semi-automatic rifles who asked him, politely, who he belonged to. Dale said he belonged to himself. They said that wasn't how things worked up here anymore. They told him their group was called the Ridgeline Cooperative, which was a name that sounded democratic but functioned, based on Dale's description, as a supply raiding operation organized around a man named Tull, who Dale never saw but whose name was invoked the way middle management invokes a CEO. This changed the calculation. My compound was now a feature in a 3-body problem: the federal authority pressing from the south, the Ridgeline Cooperative surveilling from the east, and us, 41 people on 400 acres, visible to both, aligned with neither. Carl assessed the situation with a clinical detachment that made him invaluable and occasionally unbearable. The feds want to absorb you. The Ridge Group wants to observe you until they decide whether to trade with you or take from you. Both of them are waiting to see what you do next. And whatever you do next determines which one moves first. I asked what he recommended. He said I needed to do the thing I was worst at. I needed to talk to Tull. I resisted. Not because I was afraid, because talking to Tull and acknowledging that my compound existed in a political landscape, not just a geographic one. My entire philosophy since January had been, build the fence, grow the food, protect the people, ignore everything beyond the wire. That philosophy had kept 41 people alive for 10 months. But it was a philosophy designed for a world where only the infected were the threat. The world had reorganized itself while I was mending fence posts. And the new threats wore boots and carried clipboards and operated from positions I couldn't see. Donnie volunteered to make the approach. I said no. Carl volunteered. I said no. The person who went to meet Tull had to be me, because Tull would only respect the one whose name was on the deed. In a world where institutions had collapsed, ownership was the only credential that survived. My land, my fence, my meeting. I set the meeting for November 1st, 3 days away. Enough time to prepare, not enough time to talk myself out of it. Tull was not what I expected. I'd built an image from Dale's description. Armed men on a ridge, a CEO invoked but never seen. Hunting cabins repurposed as strategic positions. I expected paramilitary posture, dominance signaling, the theater of threat that small men use when they've acquired temporary power. What I found on the fire road that morning was a woman. Sandra Tull, 53 years old, former Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency officer. She'd been stationed at the Fall Creek Falls Ranger Post when the outbreak hit and had organized the evacuation of 17 hikers, 4 park staff, and a school group from Dayton whose bus driver had abandoned them. The hunting cabins on the ridge were private properties she'd commandeered under what she called her last official act as a state employee. She met me at the junction of the fire road and the logging trail, alone except for one man standing 30 yards back with a rifle he held, like someone who knew what it was for. She was shorter than me by 6 inches, sun-damaged skin, hands that had done real work. She didn't shake my hand. She offered me water from a canteen, which in survival etiquette carries more weight than any handshake. "You're Brack," she said. "The man with the farm." "I'm Brack, the man with the farm. My people have been watching your operation since September. You're well organized. Your perimeter response was impressive for civilians. Your federal problem is going to get worse." She said this the way a mechanic tells you your transmission is failing, not to frighten you, because it's what she sees. I asked how she knew about the federal problem. She said she'd intercepted 2 of the drone flights. The first one was hers. She'd sent it to assess the breach. The second one, 4 days later, was federal. She'd watched it from the ridge and logged its flight pattern. "They're mapping you for approach routes," she said. "Standard pre-integration reconnaissance. You've got about 3 weeks before they show up with more than a clipboard." I asked what she wanted. Sandra Tull sat on a fallen oak and poured herself water. She said her group had 18 people. They had defensible elevation, but no agriculture, no water source below the spring line during dry months, and no fuel reserves. They'd been supplementing through targeted raids on abandoned structures along the highway, but the viable targets were drying up. Her people were healthy and armed, but they were declining along a curve she could calculate exactly. 6 weeks, maybe 8, before the caloric deficit became a medical emergency. "I don't want your land," she said. "I want access to your water and your food production in exchange for something you need and don't have." "What's that?" "A second position, elevation, eyes on the eastern approach that the federal team will use when they stop asking and start arriving. And 18 people who know how to operate in terrain your flat-ground civilians don't understand." It was a clean offer. Complementary needs, complementary capabilities. The kind of arrangement that works on paper and collapses the moment one party's desperation exceeds the other's. I knew this. She knew I knew it. The honesty of the negotiation was itself a form of trust. Two people acknowledging the structural fragility of what they were building while building it anyway. I told her I needed to consult my people. She said she'd give me 48 hours. Then she said something that told me more about her than anything that followed. Brack, I'm going to tell you something your county commissioner friend probably already told you. The federal system isn't evil. It's just hungry. And hungry systems eat the smallest things first. Right now, your farm and my ridge are small things. Together, we're a meal that's harder to swallow. She stood, capped her canteen, and walked back toward the man with the rifle. I watched her go. The forest was quiet in the way November forests are quiet in Tennessee. The canopy stripped, the understory exposed, everything visible that had been hidden by leaves. I walked back to the compound, carrying the weight of an alliance I hadn't planned for, offered by a woman I hadn't known existed, against an institution I'd built my fence to outlast. The third barn meeting was the hardest, not because people disagreed, because they agreed too fast. And fast agreement in a survival community is the sound of desperation wearing a mask of decisiveness. I presented Tull's offer in full. Carl analyzed the strategic geometry. Donnie assessed the tactical implications. Rita asked the questions that mattered most. What happens when their people get hungry and ours get comfortable? What happens when one side calculates that the arrangement costs more than it yields? Gene asked what enforcement looked like. I told him there wasn't any. It was a handshake built on mutual need and the understanding that breaking it would leave both parties worse off. Gene looked at his daughter and said nothing. The vote was 34 in favor, 5 opposed, 2 abstentions. The 5 opposed were all people who'd arrived alone and whose survival instinct was still calibrated to minimizing human contact. I understood them. I'd been them in January, before Donnie knocked on the gate. I met Tull the following morning, and we formalized the arrangement. Her people would receive daily water allocations drawn from our well, weekly food shares proportional to their labor contribution to the compound's agricultural operations, and access to the medical supplies we had remaining. In return, they would maintain a permanent watch position on the eastern ridge, provide intelligence on federal movement along the state highway, and integrate 4 of their people into our perimeter rotation to extend our coverage. The first of her people arrived that afternoon. 2 women and 2 men, carrying packs and rifles, stepping through my gate with the careful posture of people entering someone else's territory. Donnie logged them in. Pam showed them the water station. Dale, who'd been the accidental diplomat, walked them to the section of the perimeter they'd be covering. Marcus watched from the tobacco house doorway, counting the new arrivals on his fingers. For 9 days, it worked. Tull's people were professional and courteous. Her ridge observation post reported federal vehicle movement 3 times, each time at least 48 hours before any contact materialized. The labor exchange was efficient. Her people weren't farmers, but they were physically capable and followed instructions without ego. Our food production didn't increase, but the distribution of labor freed our people for other tasks. The compound's operational capacity expanded by roughly 30% without adding a single structure. On the 9th day, Presswood's response to Carl's proposal arrived. Not by courier, by radio. Vance's voice on the task force frequency, reading a prepared statement that Carl transcribed by hand, while I stood behind him watching the pencil move. The federal authority rejected the bilateral agreement. The language was technical, but the meaning was architectural. They would not recognize the compound's autonomous governance. They would not guarantee supply access outside the regional coordination framework. They would not acknowledge any written agreement with an unclassified civilian settlement. However, they offered a revised integration proposal. The compound would be designated a federal agricultural support site under task force administration. Residents would retain physical occupancy. The land's productive capacity would be directed by Regional Allocation Authority. A federal administrator would be installed on-site. And the compound's defense would be assumed by task force security personnel, which meant my people would disarm. Carl put the pencil down. He stared at what he'd written. Then he said, very quietly, "They want the farm, Earl. Not the people, not the fence, the farm." I read the transcription 3 times. Each reading made the same sentence worse. The land's productive capacity would be directed by Regional Allocation Authority. That sentence dissolved 112 years of BRAC family tenure into a line item on a federal logistics spreadsheet. My grandfather's tobacco house, my father's fencing, my well, my chickens, my cleared pasture, my root cellar packed with jars my own hands had sealed. Directed by Regional Allocation Authority. I looked at Donnie. He was already shaking his head. I looked at Rita. She was holding her daughter, and her face held something I hadn't seen before. The expression of a person who'd argued for engagement and just watched engagement reveal itself as a euphemism for seizure. "So much for the treaty," she said. I radioed Tull that evening. Her response was immediate, which told me she'd been monitoring the federal frequency and already knew. She said one sentence. "They just told you what they're going to do. Now the only question is when." Carl estimated 2 weeks. His reasoning was institutional, not military. The rejection of the bilateral agreement had been logged, which meant the file would advance to the next desk. The next desk was operational planning. Operational planning would generate a timeline. The timeline would be accelerated by the fact that the compound's agricultural output represented caloric value that the regional authority needed before winter deepened. We were not a threat to be neutralized. We were a crop to be harvested. I made a decision that night that I hadn't discussed with anyone. I walked to the barn, unlocked the tool cabinet, and took out the county plat maps I'd inherited from my father. 411 acres, surveyed and recorded. I spread them on the workbench and studied the property lines the way I should have studied them months ago. Not as boundaries of what I owned, but as features of a terrain that other people were planning to occupy. The western boundary abutted the national forest. No road access, dense hardwood. A natural barrier that was also a natural escape route for anyone who knew the watershed. The northern boundary followed the ridgeline that connected to Tull's position. The southern boundary crossed the creek and ran to the state route. The eastern boundary, my most exposed flank, faced the ridge from which Tull had been watching and beyond which the state highway carried federal traffic. Carl found me at midnight, bent over the maps with a flashlight. He didn't ask what I was doing. He looked at the maps, then at me, and said, "You're planning to lose the front and keep the back." I was. Not consciously, not yet. But my hands had been tracing the western boundary, the forested slope that led into the national forest. And some part of me had already processed what the rest of me was still refusing to accept. That the compound, as I'd built it, could not be defended against a federal integration team. The fence was for infected. The watch rotation was for infected. The rifles were for infected. None of it was designed for the thing that was actually coming, which was a convoy of vehicles carrying paperwork that redefined my property as theirs. But the western slope, that was different. The forest beyond my fence line was ungovernable terrain. No roads, no infrastructure, no thermal signature. A population that dispersed into that watershed became invisible in ways that a population inside a fence could never be. The compound's value was its productivity. Its vulnerability was the same thing. Everything I'd built was visible from above because it was designed to produce. And production requires clearing. And clearing requires exposure. I began thinking about the compound not as a home, but as a phase. A stage in a process that had always been moving towards something I hadn't recognized because I'd been too busy building to see the trajectory. The farm had kept 41 people alive. It had attracted 41 more. It had drawn federal attention, ridge observation, and the geometry of institutional acquisition. Everything I'd done right was the mechanism by which I'd been found. And being found was the only thing I couldn't survive. Donnie appeared at 1 a.m. He looked at the maps, looked at Carl, looked at me. He said, "You're not thinking of running. I'm thinking of what running would look like if we had to. Earl, people don't run from their own land. Not your people, not BRAC people. BRAC people have never had the federal government tell them their farm is a resource to be allocated." Donnie sat down on the hay bale nearest the bench. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I've thought about every day since. There's a difference between leaving and being taken. If they come and take it, that's their crime. If you leave and lose it, that's yours. I folded the maps. I put them back in the cabinet. I didn't lock it. They came on November 12th, not with weapons drawn, with a convoy, 3 vehicles. The tan SUV at the front, Presswood driving. Behind it, a military transport truck with a canvas top and the silhouettes of 12 soldiers seated inside. Behind that, a flatbed carrying modular fencing, prefabricated shelter panels, and what I later identified as a portable satellite communications array. They brought infrastructure. They brought the physical components of an occupation designed to look like assistance. Presswood parked at the gate. She stepped out alone and walked to the fence. I met her there with Carl, Donnie, Rita, and Jean. Tull's people were on the ridge. I could see the glint of optics in the morning light. Presswood saw them too. She didn't comment. "Mr. Brack, the regional authority has approved the designation of your property as Federal Agricultural Support Site 12. I have a signed order and a transition timeline. The order is not a request. I asked what happened to my people. Your residents will be offered voluntary enrollment in the Regional Civilian Support Program. Those who enroll will retain housing privileges within the site. Those who decline will be processed through the civilian relocation system to an available federal installation." I asked what happened to me. Presswood paused. For the first time in all our encounters, something in her face moved beyond the professional mask. It was brief, but I saw it. Recognition. Not sympathy. Recognition. The expression of a person who sees the thing they're doing from the other side and cannot afford to remain there. "You would be offered a site management position, civilian grade, reporting to the federal administrator. A site management position, on my own farm. On the designated federal site, yes." Carl stepped forward. He had a folder. In it was every document he'd prepared over the past 3 weeks. Census records, resource inventories, production logs, the bilateral agreement they'd rejected, and a new document I hadn't seen. A formal appeal to the FEMA Inspector General, citing procedural violations in the classification process, filed in triplicate with copies retained. He handed the folder to Presswood. "This is a legal record of everything you've done wrong," Carl said. "It won't stop you today, but it will exist after today, and institutions have long memories when someone reminds them." Presswood took the folder. She didn't open it. She placed it on the hood of the SUV and looked at me. "Mr. Brack, I need an answer. Will you facilitate a peaceful transition, or do I need to activate the security detail?" The moment expanded. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, in my hands, in the soles of my boots standing on ground that had my family's name in its dirt. Behind me, I could hear the compound. The generator humming, a chicken complaining, Marcus Suttles coughing. The specific, irreplaceable sound of a place where people were alive because of what I'd done. And in front of me, 12 soldiers in a truck, a woman with an order, and the full machinery of an institution that had decided my success was its property. I looked at Donnie. He was staring at the transport truck. His jaw was set. I could see the calculation in his face. The same calculation every man makes when he's standing in front of something that can't be fought. Not whether to fight, but what fighting costs the people behind you. I looked at Rita. She was holding her daughter. She met my eyes and gave me the smallest nod. Not permission, acknowledgement. She knew what I was about to do before I knew it myself. I turned back to Presswood. I told her I would not facilitate a transition. I told her I would not resist a transition. I told her that what I would do was step aside, and that every person inside my fence was free to make their own choice, and that my choice was already made. Then I walked past her, past the SUV, past the transport truck, and through the gate I'd built with my own hands, in the direction of the national forest, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and the deed in my pocket. I didn't get far. Not because they stopped me, because my people did. Donnie caught up with me at the western fence line. Then Jean. Then Dale Colvin, with his crooked shoulder and his chainsaw strapped across his back. Then the Worleys, all 4 of them, carrying packs they'd assembled in the 20 minutes since I'd walked through the gate. Then Rita, with her daughter in a carrier on her chest and a bag of antibiotics she'd taken from the medical cabinet. Then others. Then more. 23 people followed me through the western fence and into the national forest. 18 stayed behind. The division was not clean. Families split. The Harmons stayed because they were too old for the terrain. Marcus Suttles came, but Pam stayed because Marcus needed to walk, and she needed him to have someone to walk toward if she couldn't keep up. She kissed his forehead at the fence line and said, "Go with Mr. Earl." And that boy, who hadn't spoken for the first 6 days I knew him, looked at her and said, "I'll count the days." Tull was waiting on the ridge. She'd watched the entire thing through a spotting scope. When I emerged from the tree line, with 23 people strung out behind me, she was standing at the fire road junction with her canteen out, and her people already organized into a reception line. "Took you longer than I expected," she said. "I had to let the land go." "You didn't let the land go, Brack. You let the fence go. The land's still here. You're standing on it." She was right in a way that took me weeks to fully absorb. The 411 acres hadn't moved. The national forest beyond it hadn't moved. The watershed, the ridge, the creek, the timber, the soil, none of it had changed ownership. What had changed was the form of my claim on it. I'd traded a deed and a fence for presence and knowledge. I knew this terrain the way my father and grandfather had known it, not as a boundary, but as a body. Its ridges and hollows, its water sources and shelter features, its seasonal patterns and game trails. That knowledge wasn't something a federal administrator could requisition. It lived in my hands and my feet, and the part of my brain that recognized slope and aspect and drainage, without conscious thought. Over the following days, Tull and I reorganized. Her ridge position became the hub. My people integrated with hers. The labor exchange that had been formal became organic. We dispersed across the western slope in small groups, using natural shelters and improvised structures that left no thermal signature visible from altitude. Carl Worley, whose government expertise had been our shield, became our cartographer. He mapped every feature of the national forest within a day's walk, using my father's plat maps as the baseline and extending outward. The federal team occupied the compound. I watched them through binoculars from the ridge. They repaired the fence. They expanded the garden. They installed the satellite array and the modular shelters. They brought in personnel. Within a week, my farm was producing under new management, feeding a system I'd been excised from. But they didn't have the watershed. They didn't have the ridge. They didn't have the forest knowledge or the terrain literacy or the relationships with the landscape that a century of BRAC labor had accumulated. And when winter came and the infected pushed south through the national forest in numbers that overwhelmed fixed positions, the federal team's perimeter failed in exactly the way mine had failed on October 21st. Except they didn't have Tull on the ridge, calling out approach vectors. They didn't have Donnie in the tree line, dropping targets at 60 yards. They didn't have a logging road to fall back on, or a fire road to resupply through, or a watershed to disappear into when the arithmetic turned against them. They had my farm. I had the land around it. And the land, it turned out, was the thing that had always mattered. Presswood radioed on the emergency frequency in December, not with orders, with a request. They needed us, not our compliance, not our enrollment, not our voluntary participation in a system that had reclassified our home as its asset. They needed the knowledge that lived in the terrain we'd retreated into, the watershed expertise, the ridge positions, the dispersed survival architecture that no convoy could deliver and no satellite could map. I sat with the radio for a long time before I answered. Carl advised terms. Tull advised silence. Donnie said it was my call and meant it. Rita nursed her daughter by a fire built from timber harvested on land that technically belonged to everyone and practically belonged to no one. I keyed the radio and told Presswood what I'd told her at the gate. I would not facilitate. I would not resist. I would cooperate on terms that recognized my people as partners, not subordinates. And the deed in my pocket, wrinkled and sweat-stained and legally meaningless in a world without courts, would remain mine. Not as a claim of ownership, but as a record of who built what first and why it mattered. She agreed. Not because she wanted to, because the winter was killing her operation, and my forest was keeping mine alive. Sovereignty, I learned, is not a fence. It's the knowledge that makes the fence unnecessary.